Hello and welcome to Social Church. We're really excited to be recording another brilliant Q&A today with a good friend of ours, Bruce Gore. Bruce, we've got a great question for you today. How was the Bible put together?
Well, the way in which the Bible was originally assembled is a very interesting question, and there's actually been a fair amount of some debate and controversy about it. We have a pretty good idea with respect to the Old Testament, of course, because that was delivered to the Christian community from the Jewish world. There were several accepted canons in the Jewish view of things, the so-called Palestinian canon, the Samaritan canon, and the Alexandrian canon. Each of them defined the Old Testament a little bit differently. The Samaritan canon was the most restrictive. The Alexandrian was the most liberal, including what is sometimes called the Apocrypha. But the Christian church, for the most part, landed on a view that the Palestinian canon was the canon to be accepted from the Old Testament. There's, of course, been a difference in between Protestants and Catholics as to the use of the Apocrypha. That's probably a little beyond the scope of the question, but be that as it may, for the most part, the Old Testament canon has been accepted as it came down to us from Jewish tradition. The New Testament era is not as neat. You know that in the first century, a variety of documents were generated. They were written by various people at various times in various places, and they were viewed as sufficiently important that copies began to be made of them. Of course, nobody had a Gutenberg press at that time, so these were handwritten copies, but the copies were circulated, and here and there they began to show up. As the Christian movement in the second century continued to spread, you find various of those documents appearing here and there, some used in some communities, some used in others, but generally a kind of consensus was developed over time that these were important documents. There was a little bit of a difference of opinion early on. In the second century, you have a canon that was called the Muratorian canon. It was produced probably about the year 170 A.D. It basically set forth the books that we have in our standard New Testament canon with a couple of exceptions. But for the most part, it looked very much like the canon that we have. Other communities accepted some books, rejected others. It was a very interesting kind of debate. Ultimately, the leadership in the church used various criteria to try to determine what books should be included and what shouldn't. One of the most important criteria was, could it be shown that a particular book was written either with apostolic authorship or with apostolic sanction? For example, the book of Romans was clearly written by the Apostle Paul. Nobody ever seriously doubted that the book of Romans should be in the canon. Other books were not quite so clear. The Gospel of Mark was written by Mark. Mark is not an apostle, but it was commonly understood that Mark wrote based on the supervision, or you might say the conversation going on with the Apostle Peter. And so sometimes the Gospel of Mark is viewed as something of the memoirs of Peter. Other books were written. Luke was writing under the effect and influence of the Apostle Paul, and so on. When I say apostolic origins or sanction, that's what we're getting at. With some books, it wasn't so clear. No one was clear about who wrote the book of Hebrews. It was always a bit of a question mark. Some thought maybe it was Paul, and yet the stylistic differences are so dramatic that I think it's commonly understood that Paul probably did not write the book of Hebrews. We don't know who did. Maybe it was Apollos, a man from Alexandria. Other criteria kicked in at that point to argue in favor of Hebrews and other books like it, namely that its theological content was viewed as so insightful and so authoritative that it had a place in the Christian world, and most importantly, that many Christian communities used it with great positive effect in their worship. And so those three criteria, apostolic origins, theological consistency, youth in the community of faith, all of those argued in favor of the books that were in play. Many books were rejected, far more were rejected than those that were accepted. The process took some 3 centuries, actually, before there was finally a complete unanimous consent and agreement on the matter. It wasn't as if there was some official authorized list that came floating down from heaven. This was definitely a sifting process. But by the time we reached the year 397 and what's called the Council of Carthage, you might say the final stamp of approval was laid out, and the 27 books that we have in our New Testament were more or less accepted at that point without any further great debate or concern about it. The canon issue was raised once again at the time of the Reformation. Many people know that Luther had a few questions about the book of James. He wasn't so sure about Revelation. There have been other questions raised from time to time, but for the most part, those have not served to undermine confidence, but if anything, have served as the issue has been revisited to confirm our confidence that the books that we have in our New Testament are indeed the ones that ought to be there. So it's not a real simple question, and of course there's been a lot of attention given to it, but in simple terms you might say, generalizing, that's the basic picture as to how the New Testament canon was formed.
Bruce, thank you so much, that's really helpful. If you would like to have one of your questions answered on a later episode, then please do get in touch. You can contact us via our website www.wearesocialchurch.com or contact us via any of our social media platforms. Thanks a lot for listening today. Bye for now.